and teaching the supremacy of Christ in all of life.
Lord, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and you have the words of eternal life.
Whatever thoughts you have need to conform to what the Scriptures say.
Right here in the Bible, we have all the evidence that is needed to prove that Jesus is the fulfillment.
Every second of every day is God's grace on us. That gives us the power to walk through life. But who remembers last time we discussed this? How should a church make decisions? You remember kind of where we landed?
I remember, obviously, Scripture is our authority. And then if you can't come to a clear decision, and of those who are in leadership kind of stand upon their conviction and we submit to that.
Yeah, I think, we definitely talked about that, and especially the part about being in gridlock almost, or wondering, where there's not just real obvious consensus. What do you do there? That's kind of what I want to look at the very end. But like Tom said, Scriptures are authority, but of course not everyone agrees on what the Scriptures say, right? And so that's where it gets tricky. But remember, we called this idea of what we think the Scriptures teach congregational consensus, is the way we described it. And what that means is, as a church, as a congregation, as a body, we should try to make decisions together. And we all have different roles and different parts. And what part does the leadership play in that? Does everyone just vote and the leadership gets 2 votes? Or like, how does that work, right? Well, we started looking at a few places in the Scriptures where churches had to make important decisions. And a lot of them that we see in the Scriptures have to do with church discipline. And before I pull it up or tell you where to go, where would you go to look for how a church was to conduct a church discipline process? Do you know? Matthew 18 is primarily where folks go. So if you want to turn there, this might give us some insight into how churches might make decisions. If you want to flip to Matthew 18. We're going to zero in on verses 15 to 18 if one of you guys would like to read that for us. Yep.
Matthew 18, 15 to 18 says, "Now if your brother sins, go and show him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. If he does not listen to you, take 1 or 2 more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven."
Okay, I want to start with a question. What or who is not here that you would expect to be involved in church discipline, as far as the church goes? Is there any mention of elders or leadership in this passage? I think that's a little bit telling. I think clearly here, based on Jesus' words, the church, people to people, relationship to relationship, are to handle these things. Of course, as the whole church, when it gets to a certain point, when it comes to church discipline, the whole church should be involved, right? Not just leadership, not just the few people involved. Let's look at another passage on church discipline that gives us a little more insight, I think. 1 Corinthians 5. It's just 2 verses, so maybe I'll just read it from here. "For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Are you not to judge those who are within the church? But those who are outside, God will judge. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves." And in this letter, it's to the whole church. Paul addresses this letter to Corinth, to the whole church, and they're to do this. In the second letter, Paul writes to them, he says, "Sufficient for such a one is the punishment which was inflicted by the many." So this church did some form of church discipline to someone, and listen to the way Paul says. He said, this was sufficient. It was inflicted by the many, by all of you, so that on the contrary, you should rather graciously begin to forgive them. And I know all that is specifically about church discipline, but I think we can learn some things from this. Number one, I think we see that the word church used over and over again by Jesus is the word ecclesia, which is actually a political assembly. It's a group of people in that day that would come together to make decisions. And so also Jesus talks about binding and loosing. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Meaning the authority in which you act is the authority in which God is acting. So there's this authority to make decisions given to the church. So here's how I would summarize it. In the New Testament, the body as a whole has the authority and decision-making power in the church. So your next question might be, all right, what about church leaders then? None of that was addressed to church leaders in Corinth or in Matthew. So do they have a role to play? What would you guys say to that?
I mean, they're part of the church, so they were part of that decision making with everybody else.
Yeah.
Not set apart.
Yeah. Do you think the church should care what their church leaders say on a matter that the church is deciding on? Yeah. Well, let's look at a couple places in the New Testament that gives us some insight on church leaders and how they should be involved with the body. Jesus says this in Luke 22. "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, the one who is greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant." So Jesus is letting his disciples know, you guys aren't going to be little popes. Okay, you're not going to be bishops in the sense that the Catholic Church says, right? Where you just make all the decisions and everyone falls in line. You're to be a servant. You're to be one of the body and to not lord it over those that you have authority over. Look at how Peter addresses elders in 1 Peter 5. "Therefore I exhort the elders among you, shepherd the flock of God, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock." When we start talking about elders next week, these are the kind of things, this is why I think this lesson's kind of runs alongside and is related to the elder lesson next week. We need to be looking at how do elders and the church coexist? How do they function together? Not lording it, not domineering, but being examples, shepherding, teaching, serving. And what else is interesting is at the beginning of almost every New Testament letter, the author addresses the letter not to the leadership, but to the whole church. Romans is addressed simply to the saints in Rome. The Corinthians letters were written to the church. Galatians was written to the churches of Galatia. The saints were the recipients of Ephesians. Philippians addresses the leaders along with the saints. Colossians was to the saints and brothers. So there's just this evidence mounting, I think, especially in today's day and age. I think we've gone overboard. I think we're off balance. I think leadership in churches are doing too much. I think they are lording it over. I think they are domineering too much. I think we need to get back to the biblical balance of leaders and the body making decisions together. And I think it's a delicate balance. And so let's look at a few more passages that might help us understand what that balance might be. Everyone flip to Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews 13. We'll just look at one verse for now. Verse 17. What do you guys want to read that verse for us?
Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you.
Okay, a lot of folks will go to this verse and say everything I just said about not domineering or lording it over, and they'll say, but hey, basically, church, obey your leaders, submit to them, problem solved, right? They make the decisions, everyone else get in line. Those of you that listened to that lesson a week or two ago, do you remember? Josh laid out the case for why that might not be true. You guys remember looking at the Greek in that verse and how it tells a different story? Actually, the Greek word for obey in that passage is not the normal word for obey. It actually means to persuade or convince. And the Greek word for submit is not the normal word for submit. It's actually a Greek word that means to yield after a struggle. So here's maybe the best way to translate what we just read in Hebrews. Be persuaded by your leaders and yield to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Now, does that read a little different than obey and submit? Right? Be persuaded by. That means when they're talking to you, when they're teaching you, you should be more likely to be convinced or be persuaded if these leaders that you've chosen as elders, you trust them, right? Be persuaded by them. Try your best to hear what they have to say and be convinced. And yield to them if need be. So after a struggle, like a debate, a long discussion, multiple weeks of talking it over, maybe you're the only holdout. I think what the author of Hebrews is calling them to, for the sake of unity, for the sake of consensus, is to yield. If you're the one holding it up, I think you yield. I think that's biblical. But it's not obey and submit. It's not just hear what that leader has to say. Now there's nothing you can do about it. They've already made their mind up. There's no convincing them. No, it's a conversation. It's a back and forth. But at the end of the day, the church that has chosen leaders over them, the way God has set it up to bring about peace and unity is eventually the parties who are holding out should yield. But it can be after a long time, a lot of conversation. So, how exactly do church leaders help churches come to consensus? Well, before we look at some of that, what would you guys say? Church leaders, church planners, elders, deacons, people like that, how would they help churches come to consensus?
I'd say by teaching scriptures on how they interpret whatever that decision is.
I think primarily, especially from elders, through teaching it. But I do think it goes beyond that. I think there's more to it than just teaching. And I want to show you through the scriptures exactly what elders and other leaders should be doing. So in Acts 15, we read this: it seemed good to the apostles and the elders with the whole church to choose men from among them. So I think maybe one principle we learned just from that is to not, as church leaders, alienate or not worry about what the rest of the church thinks. Just make decisions apart from them. I don't think that should be the case. In 1 Peter, again.
Back up to that.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
It says to choose men from among them. So many want to go out and bring somebody in, because of whatever status or whatever.
That's a good point.
They don't know them, but even people don't know them.
Yeah, I think especially when we look at the elder lesson next week, I think it is so important to see that the primary way you select elders is from among your congregation, right? You don't seek outside your body to add to your body in leadership, because so much of what elders are called to be is about their character. How can you just go out to LinkedIn and just find the best resume and bring them in? Right? That doesn't make sense. A guy can have all the credentials you want, But if he's not a good husband and father and good Christian, he's not qualified to be an elder. Right? Those things are important.
And you're the one discipling that person. You've seen the growth. You've had those conversations, and you know like you're saying, the character, but you also know where they stand.
Yes.
Pretty fully.
There's been so many churches that I've heard be swindled over a couple interviews. They really like the guy. He's great in an interview, but then as soon as you hire him, he's someone totally different. He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. He's something you didn't think he was. Well, that's a lot. That could still happen, right? That could still happen, in our setting. It's a lot less likely, right? You've come to know people for a few years. What's more likely, them to fool you over a few years or 2 interviews? It's just, I think this is not just biblical, but it's common sense too, right? And so in 1 Peter 5, Peter writes this to elders: shepherd the flock. So we're asking the question, what do church leaders do to help bring consensus? Teach, include the church, but shepherd, oversee, not under compulsion, but willingly according to God, not for dishonest gain, but with eagerness, not lording it over those allotted to you, but being examples to the flock. I think Peter's picking up what Jesus was laying down, wasn't he? When he was talking about not lording it over each other. Being examples, shepherding, overseeing. So it might be just in conversation the church is having. I mean, let's get real practical. Over the last couple weeks or months, we've had a lot of conversations, right? And I think as church leaders, it should be their job to make sure those people are having good conversations, that you're following up, you're asking questions, you're making sure everything's being done properly. And then being a good example. Whatever you're asking your people to do, you should be that example to do it. And then look here at Ephesians 4. Paul writes this, and he gave, talking about Jesus, he himself gave some as apostles, as prophets, as evangelists, as shepherds and teachers, those church leaders, for the equipping of the saints for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ. And this comes back to the idea of teaching, but the idea that the body, it goes beyond the leadership. Right? It goes beyond just those few gifts. The leadership should be equipping people to be the body. I do have another question, though. What exactly does consensus mean? Is it the same as a simple majority? So if we're saying churches should have consensus on issues, what does that mean? Is that just 51% over 49%? One more vote than the other group? Is that consensus? What would you guys say?
I'd say the body as a whole comes to an agreement, maybe whether you fully agree or not, but you're willing to submit to that.
So I think majority to me is just 51%, right? A simple majority. I don't think that's what the Bible teaches, is to just have one more vote than the other side and then you move forward. I think what churches should strive for is the vast majority of the church is in agreement. You may not always get to 100%. There may be holdouts. But after enough time and many conversations, the few still in disagreement should think about what Hebrews says, that they should yield to their leaders and to the consensus of the church, right? Leadership and the rest of the church shouldn't want to just drag people along unwillingly, right? That should never be the desire. It should always be, let's get 100%. And those few that are holding out, or even if it's 49%, well, we need to slow down. There's no time, there's no rush, right? What's the rush? Just slow down and make sure you get it right. Make sure you have enough time for everyone to be heard, for everyone to be able to speak to this issue. So that's how I would answer what consensus would be. Follow up on that? Thoughts? And I'd love to continue to have this conversation around the Lord's Supper today, or just going forward as we teach on elders next week, because this is related. So, another follow-up question. How will everyone know where the whole church stands on issues? Should we ever have a vote? What do you guys think?
I think just through our conversation and stuff, that we would know where everybody stands.
I think ideally, if you have the right form of church, right? We talked about this a lot. The right form, biblically. We're looking at the Bible and how did they do it? What did they look like? How large was that church? What was their relationships like? When you look at all that, you could say, I think they didn't have to have a vote. There was none of that in the New Testament, right? So how do you know in your own family? Think about your own house. You guys take votes on things? Probably not. Maybe you do. So maybe I don't want to use that example. But for the most part, isn't it, if you're being a good mom and dad, especially as your kids get older, you might include your older kids, even old enough kids, in what your family's doing, the change of direction. If you're going to move homes, change schools for your kids, or something that affects them in some way. Now, does that mean they get to make the decision? Maybe not, right? But ideally, in your home, you're just constantly, it's in the car, you're talking about it, right? It's over dinner, you're talking about it. It's casual conversations over game night, or just whenever. You're together so much. The opportunities for conversations happen to the point where eventually I don't need to take a vote. I know where my youngest daughter stands, and I know where my oldest son stands, and I know where my wife stands. We've talked about it a bunch. I know we don't need to take a vote. I know what they're going to say, So I think would be my understanding. We should be so close with each other, have so much conversation about it, especially around the Lord's Supper or whenever we can get together, over dinner, over the phone. We should know, because we're doing church the way we're called to be. We'll know, right? And if you don't know, it's pretty simple. There's 40 or 50 of us max, right? We could easily find out by just talking to each other. And if we have to vote, that means we're not close enough to know where each other stand. And I think something's missing at that point.
Probably we've all been part of churches that were that big that we do have the vote, and it's kind of a safe moment there. You don't have to talk about it. Nobody has to see it. Like, just put your vote in, and you can disagree in secret. You never really have that conversation. And whatever happens, you might still have resentment. You might never have that conversation. Those feelings, those beliefs never really get dealt with. And sometimes those folks are just out. You just haven't seen them for a while, and nobody's had that conversation with them. It's just, the church is too big to have even noticed that. And so, yeah, it's a safety thing. We do, obviously you trust your leadership to talk that over for you and come up with those decisions. That's how some of those bigger churches have been. But yeah, to remain smaller, it wouldn't make sense to do that. Everybody needs to be able to have that conversation and be persuaded. Humility, really.
I mean, think back to how we started looking at those church discipline passages, right? Most people in a lot of churches today aren't involved in any sort of church discipline process or helping resolve it. Why? They're not close with any of those folks. They don't know the situation. They don't know any of them. And so church leadership just handles it, right? And then maybe they let everyone know at the end or something, right? But ultimately, the idea that why would we allow just a few parts of the body to make and do all the work for the rest of the body, right? It doesn't make sense. It'll wear them out. It's not healthy. And all of us have gifts that we can all use when we come to these things that's going to help. So again, this is another good question I think we need to think about. So how should a church work through disagreements during this process? When not everyone is on the same page. How should a church work through that? I want to make a couple points, and then I'd love to hear from you guys. I don't think a church should ever rush a decision when you don't have consensus. There's a couple reasons for that. First is probably obvious. There's folks that are out there disagreeing and uncomfortable with where we're at or the decision that we might go to. Why would we want to just force them to go along to get along and to not be heard and to not have time to convince us. The second point I want to make is I think this becomes easier the closer we are. So if we have built long-lasting, deep relationships and then you have a disagreement, your first instinct isn't to leave or look at them and be mad at them or, turn your back on them. Your first instinct should be, I love them. I know we've spent so much time together. I know who they are. I know their character. And just because we disagree doesn't mean this about that person personally, right? So relationships should be strong. This is why we do church this way, to be close with one another. So love runs deep. And so when people have disagreements, we don't immediately just become upset or want to alienate ourselves or abandon people. And I know that's, again, I keep coming back to just the way we should do things in our family. Church is a family, right? We're brothers and sisters. Your first instinct in your family shouldn't be run, shouldn't be kick them out, right? It shouldn't be don't talk to them. I know a lot of our families maybe do that, especially extended families. But we all know that's unhealthy. We know that's not the way it should be, right? What should healthy families do in disagreements? Talk to one another. Love each other through it. Assume the best. Think of 1 Corinthians 13, right? That attitude we should have toward one another in disagreement is what we're striving for. Disagreements are going to come, right? The closer we are, the more you get to know people. The Bible's full of a lot of difficult stuff. There's a lot of different doctrines. There's a lot of different theologies. There's a lot of different ways to view it. We're not all going to agree 100%. There's just no way, right? We're still finite. We don't have it all figured out. Let's just be patient with one another and work through it. Trust, fall back on that closeness you have with your brother or sister, that they mean well, that they love the Lord, that they're not meaning anything ill in this. And I think that'll help. I don't know. What do you guys think? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even if you're 100% sure of yourself, I think it's important to listen and even look into what somebody else's argument is. Where's that coming from? And read up on that. Not just dismiss it. Just listen to those disagreements. And you understand that person well enough. Just knowing that you're not yielding. Yeah, just trying to start a new doctrine or look for power or anything. Just listen and hear and be open to those positions as well. I think that, obviously there's a lot of denominations, a lot of different things people believe in, and so like I said, even if you're 100% certain, just be open to why do they think that way, and try to see that point of view as well without dismissing it.
I've said this to a lot of people. If you've ever been wrong one time on something you thought you were for sure right about, that'll change real quick your perspective on disagreeing with other brothers and sisters. There were things for sure I was right about, and I would have maybe walked away from a church because I was so sure about this thing. And now I maybe have changed course, or I disagree with my former view. And now when I look at my other brothers and sisters that are real strongly convinced of something that I might not agree with, maybe they're right. I've been wrong before, right? Just, again, humility in all that is so key. Having love in all of it. Willing to change, willing to go where the Scripture takes you. And I know we all say that. I think we'd all like to think that. But I think it's good to take some time to really pray about it and really think, especially in times of disagreement, is my attitude right? Do I really love that other brother or sister? Am I willing to listen to them? Am I willing to change if I have to?
A lot of times we might read into things so that we can get our rebuttals ready, really to make our own arguments concrete versus reading into something with that open. Maybe this is maybe there's some truth there. Maybe there's a lot of truth there. Versus, how can I deconstruct this thought and win this argument?
Mm. Okay, that's good. So, just to wrap up, the body as a whole should be the one with authority. Decision-making powers in the church. Church leaders have a role in that. They should influence and persuade the church with shepherding, teaching, and their example. But they don't lord it over the church. So if there's situations where there's debate or deliberation or disagreement, the body should yield to and be persuaded by their leaders in the end. If it has to come down to that, that's where it ends. Much of this process shouldn't just be a vote. It shouldn't just be a big meeting. It should be organically. We should be talking to each other, having close relationship, getting to know each other's thoughts and opinions during the Lord's Supper, midweek conversations, informally, sometimes during the teaching time back and forth, but ultimately just being with one another, knowing each other like a family. I just want to end with this kind of exhortation here. I think doing this is hard. I think it takes time. It should take study, prayer, patience, most importantly, love. The ministry of leaders should help foster these things, but I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. Right? We can all go along to get along and just leave if we don't like it, like a lot of Christians do, a lot of churches do. But I don't think they're getting the benefits of having a church so close that is willing to have tough conversations and not just leave or not just lord it over everybody. And that makes it real simple. No one has a say, so then this is the way it's going to be. I think we get real unity and real true church life when we're willing to do the tough things, to have conversations, to work it out together, to have patience with one another. All those one another's become real when you have to live it out, when you've got to have tough conversations with each other. Those one another's really become important. I just want to add, if it's not obvious enough, obviously the way we have been meeting without having our ladies speak, I think if it's biblical, if it's right, then men, we have an important job to make sure our sisters are heard. We shouldn't just talk amongst ourselves in this lesson or in groups and say, yeah, church consensus, we've got it figured out. Our ladies should be heard too, right? There's a time and a place if what we're seeing is biblical, but they are part of this body. They should have their say too. And so we need to make sure that happens, especially if they're our wife or our daughter. As a husband or a father, we got to make sure that we're leading our family well, teaching our family, hearing from our family, listening to them. So I just want to make sure we all heard that too. That's important. And so next week when we touch on elders, this is the kind of thing when we look at our qualifications for elders, and once we have established elders, it's still this process, right? Not a lot really is going to change ultimately. I mean, they're going to be the ones who we yield to, and they're going to be the ones primarily in charge of shepherding. But church body, we have this important job all the time. We have the authority, right? Not just leadership. The whole body has this power to make decisions. It's an important job. So don't take it lightly.